Hello, everyone. I'm Natalie Milka, President and CEO of APAICS, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to APAICS's 2021 inaugural Energy Summit. We're excited to be hosting today's panels, which will focus on energy affordability and reliability, important topics that impact vulnerable communities especially hard. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank our event partners for their support of this summit. Thank you to the American Petroleum Institute, Microsoft, the National Resources Defense Council, Southern California Edison, and Toyota for leading the charge and ensuring AAPI voices are recognized and heard in these important policy discussions. To start us off, I want to introduce Bob G., who will be facilitating our first panel discussion. Bob is the president of Asian Americans in Energy, the Environment, and Commerce, otherwise known as AE2C. With 40 years of experience, Bob is well-versed in the world of energy as a former Assistant Secretary for Policy and International Affairs and for Fossil Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy, as well as a former Commissioner and Chairman of the Public Utility Commission of Texas. Let's welcome Bob, and I look forward to hearing this panel discussion.
Thank you, Madeline, and thank you, APAICS, for the honor of moderating this panel to kick off your APPI Energy Summit. Our topic today is getting affordable energy to underserved communities. Powerful forces of change are dominating our country's energy ecosystem, both in the electric power and transportation sectors. You need only read the daily news feed to hear more about how the utility industry is undergoing vast change to integrate cleaner and more distributed energy resources and moving to decarbonize their energy systems. Concurrently, we hear and learn more about the potential of electric vehicles to displace the internal combustion engine as our principal mode of transportation. But none of this will be immediate, and frankly, none of this will come easy. In the meantime, our country, indeed the world, will undergo a transition. We can debate about the duration and pace of this from a climate change mitigation standpoint, but no one can dispute that for the current moment, we will continue to rely on a significant share of traditional energy resources for our needs and struggle to maintain affordability for the average consumer. Even more so for those in underserved communities with lower incomes who have already borne a disproportionate share of costs from an environmental justice standpoint. For example, nearly 1/3 of US households, about 31%, reported facing challenges in paying energy bills or sustaining adequate heating and cooling in their homes, according to the Energy Information Administration's 2015 Residential Energy Consumption Survey. Further, 1 in 4 households reported reducing or forgoing necessities to pay for their energy bill, and 1 in 10 reported keeping their households at unsafe or unhealthy temperatures. And there's also speculation that these figures rose during the pandemic, with many working class individuals having to find a way to make do without sources of income for months, even for the entire year. For the average American, utility costs hover around 2.5% to 3% of their monthly income. But for those living at or below the poverty line, studies have found the percentage jumps to 20% to 30%, possibly even more. Asian Pacific Americans indeed reside in some of these underserved communities. This statement may come as a surprise to some, since our community carries an image in popular culture of being highly educated and more economically prosperous than the average American. To negate this flawed perception, my short answer is that we all did not attend the Bronx High School of Science or Harvard. A significant subset, rather, of the US Asian Pacific American diaspora is first generation and earns modest incomes from service and non-skilled trades. You can see them in our restaurants and in like establishments as members of the gig economy. So it is on behalf of those members of our community, as well as those in other ethnic groups, that our panel's discussion is focused. We are fortunate to assemble 2 experts today to share their views. Dr. R. Dean Foreman is the American Petroleum Institute's chief economist and an expert in the economics and markets for oil, natural gas, and power, with more than 2 decades of industry experience, including ExxonMobil, Talisman Energy, Sasol, and Saudi Aramco in forecasting and market analysis, corporate strategic planning, and finance risk management. He is known for knowledge of energy markets, applying advanced analytics to assess risk in these markets, and clearly and effectively communicating with management, policymakers, and the media. Lorraine Akiba is and CEO of Venture. She is a recognized leader with
Hi, everyone. So sorry about that. My name is Chris Chan. I'm with APAICS and 3C Strategies. We're obviously having a bit of technical difficulty with Bob's connection, so we're going to try and get him back. And in the meantime, I think if tech can bring us together with Dean and Lorraine, I'll go ahead and maybe ask the first question on Bob's behalf to our panelists here. So Dean, I think we wanted to start with you, and as a scene setter, could you please provide us with an overview of energy production around the world today? A lot of Americans have been seeing rising energy bills, gasoline prices, and airfare costs over the last 6 months and don't understand why. Can you walk us through the current landscape of energy production and how it impacts pricing?
Thank you. I hope you can hear me well. Let's just start with looking out the window today, what we see. According to AAA, regular gasoline prices across the country, for the last few weeks, they've been trending above $3 per gallon. Today, it's $3.15 per gallon. If you're buying natural gas wholesale, it's up to $3.75 per million BTU. Both of these are some of the highest prices that we've seen since 2014 for a July. And it's happening because as the economy is coming back, demand is resuming, but the supply side of it is still stuck where it's not responding so quickly. So we're getting a mismatch where we're seeing demand outstrip supply, and by economic fundamentals, that tends to put upward pressure on prices. Now let's put it in perspective, because you kind of know after the COVID-19 pandemic and the recovery, people are still driving and flying less than they were before the pandemic. But what's happened is with the shift to online retailing, there's actually more freight shipping than there was pre-COVID. And in terms of intermediate products, normally the intermediate products that go into refining and petrochemicals, so these are things by name like naphtha and gas oil and propane and propylene, those products are normally about a quarter of total US petroleum demand, a full 25% of it, very quietly. But they go into all the things that the average household really wants in terms of consumer goods, things that are made of plastic. And through COVID, those burgeoned medical plastics, things that are pliable, sterile packaging, and all of that with variants of COVID has continued to remain strong. So demand this last week, if we look at the U.S. Energy Information Administration's data, 21.5 million barrels per day and trending above where it was in 2019, forget 2020. So in those 2019 data points that we're comparing against were some of the strongest in 11 years. So it's not just the US. If we're looking at the Energy Information Administration's global projections, they also show that global demand is very close to where it was in 2019. So the economy, demand for liquids, for natural gas, they go hand in hand. Now on the supply side, Normally, there would be a drilling response that would come with this, where economists would assume, build it and they will come. Basically, if the demand's there, you will supply more. But that's not happening yet, and that's partly a function of the fallout from the crisis through COVID-19, partially a function of just the workforce issues that many supply chains are having across many industries. But having cast off so many employees in this industry over the last year or two, if many companies want to expand quickly, they have to find a way to recontract for some of those. And to do that, you don't just contract for a month. If you hire somebody, you're hiring them. If you contract for a rig to go drill something, you're probably signing up for a year or two at a time. So these are commitments, and people have to believe it, and they have to have financing in place. We talk about longer-term energy transition issues and the policies of the new administration that haven't been entirely friendly toward the oil or the natural gas or fossil fuel development industry. So it sends a lot of signals that's making it harder for the industry, both in the US and globally, to invest. Now, what's that mean? Let's go back. We started with prices for the average household. We know over the last 10 to 15 years, energy has gone down to the tune of 15%, while food, education, and healthcare have gone up. That's helped households make ends meet. And now that these prices are going back towards these 2014 levels, that's a potential squeeze at the same time that households are also, and you kind of have two Americas here, right? You have the lower 40% of households by income that almost never make ends meet. And then you have upper income ones that are also now seeing costs across the board go up. And when we add up energy, vehicles, and housing, those three categories just by themselves are more than half of what a typical household spends in a given year. And those things are going up. And with energy going up, make no bones about it, that if you've got a shift toward electrification, today electric vehicles are not less expensive than internal combustion engine vehicles. If you want to change out the housing stock to be more efficient, and keep in mind that whether we're looking at Europe or we're looking at the Northeast United States, across the country, you have places that are still using 50-year-old boilers for either kerosene or fuel oil, heating oil. This capital stock does not change out quickly, and it's not less expensive to do it, except in a business case of looking at the fuel cost over time, which can be less expensive. But prematurely or economically retiring these assets and changing out those things doesn't happen overnight. The odds that this can happen in the next 9 years, by 2030, in a massive way are going to be very expensive and probably overly optimistic. So with the current trajectory of prices, the current supply-demand balance, as API, we don't make or publish our own price forecasts for antitrust reasons, but we can look at the fundamentals and say they look tight with this lack of investment. And the way to think of this is we have a record amount of global oil demand growth this year and next combined by official estimates, with a record low amount of investment industry-wide due to the fallout from last year. That disconnect, without investment, you don't have the energy to supply and keep the economy going. And this ties all the way back to the household bottom line, where we can say if oil were to go from like $70 up to $100 a barrel, that's another 70 to 80 cents per gallon. For an average household, that's $640 a year. It's another 1% of after-tax income on average. And if you're talking about the lower of 20% of households by income in the US, and this is diverse across the entire country, you're talking 2.5 times larger the impact on a percentage basis. So that's 2.5% of income just for that energy component. So these are, I think it's a big deal, and I think it's a systemic problem where we need policies that are enabling of both resource development, so it doesn't stymie both the economy as a whole and the impact to the household bottom line.
That makes a lot of sense. I believe we might have Bob back, so if so, I'm going to kick it off to let him run with it.
Welcome back, Bob.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that I don't chip off again, but I know that these two panelists are very capable of basically self-moderating, so I have little concerns. Let me follow up just for a moment, Chris. Excuse me, Dean, if I may, or Dr. Foreman. I understand that your view is that, from your standpoint, additional supply is necessary in order to maintain affordability. particularly as it pertains to transportation and transportation fuels. But as you know, there is discussion now of accelerating the build out of electric vehicle capability in the United States with a goal. General Motors, for instance, announced it's going to stop building any internal combustion engine vehicles in 2035 and switching over entirely to EVs. Do you anticipate that future electric vehicle market growth could potentially blunt the demand for liquid transportation fuels coming from, for instance, petroleum, and potentially exert downward pressure on prices?
Eventually, there's no question that if you're lowering that source of demand and demand growth, that there could be a price impact that goes with that. But the question is, how do we get from here to there, and what's the supply response in the interim if people are expecting this to happen? So a lot of the investments in our industry, they're long-lived or lived investments that have to last 20 years or more. Why would you spend the money if you don't expect to be able to recover that cost over the life of the asset? This creates a real chicken and egg problem of how do you get enough supply, and then if the US or other developed economies are not likely from a supply perspective to step up to the same degree now, then you're more reliant, as you were in parts of the early 2000s before the financial crisis, and in 2011 to 14, more reliant upon OPEC and Russia, which raises other concerns about being able to have a viable supply and a responsive supply that helps keep these prices in check. So that's the supply side of it. And then the demand side is that it's largely a rich country problem right now, in the sense that we can talk in the United States and Europe, Japan, major developed economies about rolling out electric vehicles and finding ways to subsidize those to a point, hoping that the market economics kick off and they stand on their own in a competitive marketplace on more of a level playing field. But that the technology, together with growth and reinforcement in electricity generation, transmission, distribution, there's a lot of infrastructure that people are being asked to pay for quietly here and aren't completely aware of. And in most emerging economies, in Asia Pacific in particular, the idea that you're going to be able to both afford that vehicle and fund all that new infrastructure is somewhat pie in the sky. I went to a reception last night. I'm on the advisory board for the African Energy Chamber. And one of their key themes right now is this, and I made reference to the International Energy Agency. This is the Paris-based IEA.
Right.
And they have a scenario out right now, the net zero to 2050, which calls for no new fossil fuel or oil and gas developments between now and 2050. Well, that's a problem for continents like Africa and many economies across Asia Pacific, where you're trying to continue to have people move up the income chain, to develop, to have many of the same consumer goods that everybody else wants and that many of the developed economies already have. And it creates a have and have not kind of scenario where you're competing with this emissions constraint now and the cost potentially of an emissions system to make that go. So we need global solutions that minimize these costs. We do need a level playing field for these, and technology, and I think electrification is a good thing. I drive one of these. Electric vehicles are have many favorable characteristics. It's a question of how they fit in both from an economic standpoint and with consumer preferences, including affordability.
Understood. We'll get back, and I want to expand on this theme a little bit, particularly as it pertains to the energy transition and the issues dealing with that. But at this time, let me go ahead and turn to Lorraine and just start off the conversation with you, Lorraine. As you know, Hawaiians have paid the highest rates and steepest bills for energy compared to any other state in the United States. So with an aging grid infrastructure, what role do you see renewables and distributed energy technologies such as storage play in providing opportunities and affordable energy in underserved communities on the Hawaiian Islands?
Yeah, Bob, as you pointed out in your introduction, as I was listening to your description of pandemic reality in terms of the energy burden and the energy deserts that have been created in many communities just by virtue of the economic impacts of the pandemic. It brought to mind that in Hawaii, when I first became a commissioner back in 2012 for the Hawaii PUC, that was the issue. Energy was unaffordable. We were reliant on oil and imported fossil fuels as our main generation source for the electric sector. People were having to make that very difficult decision. Do I pay my electric bill, or do I buy medicine, or do I forego doing this or that in my personal and impacting quality of life? And in Hawaii, we have a lot of people pre-COVID, pre-pandemic that lived at the federal poverty level, and the cost of living is very high. We are a tourism-based economy, service-based economy, island. Where everything must be imported in terms of food. It's a resilience concern when you only have 2 weeks of supply of food. Should that get disrupted, let alone the energy supply is dependent on imported oil. So a renewable energy, clean energy, they actually are cheaper than continuing to be stuck on that cycle of fossil fuel usage, given all the impacts and the volatility of imported oil on the international markets. And we don't have natural gas, so everything was oil or diesel coming into the island. So renewable energy is something we have a lot of. The sources, we are blessed with many natural resources, whether that's wind, solar, geothermal on some of our islands, hydro on some of our islands. Kauai Island is one of the wettest spots on the earth. You've got active volcanoes, and Kilauea on the Big Island of Hawaii that are a source of geothermal their energy for the Puna geothermal facility that Hawaii Electric Light and Company, Hawaiian Electric subsidiary on that island utilizes as part of its renewable portfolio. And even with respect to waste to energy, we are islands. So, what do you do with your municipal solid waste and solid waste management? So in Hawaii, with best available control technologies, we are able to use solid waste and burn that for energy. That constitutes biomass, and we give that credit for renewable energy. But that all takes a modern grid, especially now with more increased penetration of solar, whether that's rooftop solar or distributed energy resources behind the meter or large scale utility renewables. So the modernized grid is critical, and that infrastructure is very important. So it is actually an opportunity now under the Biden administration in terms of more infrastructure resources going to modernize the grid. And that may not be, just building out more transmission or substations. This is investing in the technology, the grid edge technology that allows us to integrate more renewable energy, which is cheaper, cleaner, better, to do such strategies as microgrids with all the intelligence and software that and technology that can utilize distributed energy resources, the power control systems, not only in energy storage tools like batteries, but also in the inverters for solar panels that can provide traditional ways of supporting the grid, which we used to do with spinning reserves of keeping, steam turbines running in order to have, voltage regulation and ancillary services to the grid. This can now be done, with modern technology to use the inverters, to use some of the power control systems to provide reactive power to keep the grid in balance. So there's many tools in the toolkit now, thanks to the technology that is developed, but it's being able to harness that in a modern grid. And right now, one of the main things that the Hawaiian Electric companies are looking at, and it is an actual active docket, open with technical working groups, representing industry stakeholders as well as the utilities and community-based organizations involved in implementing the integrated grid planning effort, because what happens at the distribution level does affect what happens at the transmission level, and dealing with all these different policies and programs that we can really harness not only renewable resources, but behind the meter customer resources to support the grid and build a robust grid of the future for Hawaii's utilities of the future.
You've got about I've got about 10,000 questions to ask you, but let me just start off. Before I begin, a small program note. I think that my audio was cut off before I had introduced you. And so I do want to let the audience know that Lorraine Akiba is a veteran from the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission and served on that commission for 6 years, from 2012 to 2018, which is when I first met Lorraine. But she is now a national thought leader. By national, I mean the lower 48, not just Hawaii, but the national thought, the other 49 states, rather, including Alaska, a national thought leader on clean energy infrastructure and grid modernization. Which brings me to my question. Hawaii is a very unique test bed for a lot of these grid technologies. It also is a very different economic profile, because it's probably one of the few states where you can actually integrate more renewable resources, and your electricity prices would actually go down because of your dependency upon imports, global imports of petroleum as a feedstock for electric power. But having said that, affordability is still an issue when you're moving to invest in new technology on the grid. It's an issue that we know confronts the lower 48 here in describing opportunities for long-distance transmission, and concerns that a lot of innovative grid technologies are going to be quite expensive. Since Hawaii has been at the vanguard of this energy evolution in terms of grid modernization, are there any lessons learned that you can share from the Hawaii experience, such as utilizing non-grid wires alternatives or non-wires alternatives to play a role to offset what would otherwise be cost escalation, both in the Hawaii's markets as well as in the lower 48?
Yeah, and I think, you kind of hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think Hawaii is unique, but, our grids are not unique. What we have demonstrated, what we have innovated, demonstrated, and implemented in Hawaii can be done anywhere, in the U.S. or internationally and globally. And, and that's why I also consult with global international stakeholders in other island economies that are trying to do the same thing. I do some work now with the government of Barbados, and they're on 100% clean energy journey. They want to reach 100% clean energy and totally decarbonize by 2030, and that's very ambitious. I mean, Hawaii's goal is to be 100% clean energy, renewable energy by 2045, and 100% decarbonized by 2045. So in all sectors, whether that's transportation, water, other sectors in this integrated energy network. What it does take, I think, is, there was a commitment of leadership, both, from the legislature, the executive branch, and on the regulatory framework. So, we developed policies and programs, not only to achieve the clean energy goals and mandates, but also to make sure to include and to be cognizant of affordability, of the digital divide, of providing resources for underserved communities. And in fact, that is built into, people probably heard, there's been a lot of national press coverage, industry press coverage on the performance-based regulation, that we have now instituted in Hawaii. The Hawaii PUC has led on that, and although there are other jurisdictions that are doing this, we're focused now on outcomes, outcome measures, metrics, not so much just on the the traditional rate case and the expenditure of that in terms of a rate cycle, but really having more flexibility so utilities can use cost savings to accomplish the goals. And part of those goals are really keeping energy affordable while integrating more renewable energy, while also focusing on underserved communities. And so the resources can go to the right things, which is, instead of a 1 cent rebate when on cost savings, you can instead deploy that money and those funds to needed capital expenditure, whether that's grid modernization, of including new types of technologies to be able to enable microgrids, let's say, or to be enable more distributed energy resources on distribution circuits and avoid with certain voltage regulation type of technology, instead of having to build out a new substation or increase transmission lines in an area. And so there's a different strategy, and the luxury is in Hawaii because we're not subject to FERC jurisdiction. There's really no formal RTO, ISO. The Hawaii PUC really is all those things. So there's no interconnection between the islands. So each island is its own energy ecosystem, and allows us to innovate and implement, which is what I think Hawaii has done but it does take a commitment at the policy level. I think Dean mentioned this earlier, that we need policies and we need a regulatory framework that incents and enables these types of actions so we can address affordability as well as decrease the energy burden for communities that are underserved, and still at the same time, drive economic growth, which we can. I mean, the energy industry, whether it's solar or, other industries, the storage industry, there's a lot of high skilled, high wage jobs that come with that. I mean, I think there's a preference in Hawaii to increase those types of jobs so that we can not just be a service-based economy that becomes terribly impacted when you have something like a pandemic where, tourists can't come and everything gets shut down, whether you're in restaurant service industry or hotels, whatever it is, transportation, tour types of jobs, everything gets impacted. So I think that's the policy matters is what I'm saying. And so we have to have these frank discussions and lay out a strategic roadmap as a community, each community in every jurisdiction. But I think the benefit of what we have in Hawaii is that we've been able to demonstrate that it works. I mean, for example, Kauai, which is not part of the Wine Electric Company, but it's a rural cooperative, a small rural cooperative. They were the first in the country to not only develop, but implement a fully dispatchable solar and storage peaker plant. So they run right now at about 85% renewable energy during the day. So they've already demonstrated you can do this. And of course, the prices, saving their members and their co-op prices of having to be using fossil generation. And they're starting to scale back and plan to retire certain units and, also enable other renewable energy. And like I said, they have the ability for doing hydro since they have a lot of water resources there.
This is very illuminating. I'm going to make a very bad joke. Your experience on an actual island might come in handy to advise the virtual island of ERCOT within.
This is true. You don't have to be, you just have to have the leadership and the decision making.
Well, folks, sorry about that. We seem to have lost Bob again, but we're going to keep on trucking here. So I think, let me see. I think I'd like to ask the next question. I unfortunately don't have the expertise that Bob does, but he's back.
I'm back. I'm sorry. Lorraine, I never caught your answer, but that's okay. We'll go offline. I just thought I would throw that out there as a thought piece to compare Hawaii and ERCOT as islands.
Yeah, it takes just leadership. I mean, you can self-island if you want to, like ERCOT, or we don't have a choice as the Hawaiian Islands. We're in the middle of the Pacific, 2,000 plus miles away from the nearest sister state. So it creates a lot of independence and self-sustainability and resilience, and that's what we're focusing on in Hawaii: reliability, resilience, addressing climate change through doing things with integrating renewable energy and making use of the latest technology that's available for supporting the grid and making us move forward in that reality.
Let me ask a question of both of you. I'm struggling. I know that each of you comes from a different perspective on energy, which is fine, which is why we're having such a rich discussion today, offering different perspectives. But let me sort of try to find a common denominator question. And this may be slightly a little bit more in the range of expertise, but I'll go ahead and throw it out. And that is, how well do you think the general public understands the trade-offs between what we have today and where we want to be in terms of moving to cleaner forms of energy, and transforming the way we use energy, both in terms of where we get our supply from and how we try to achieve efficiencies? And do they fully understand what some of these costs may be? Let me just throw that open and see if I can get both of you. And Dean, if you want to go first, that's fine. And Lorraine, this is something I know you've dealt with, in your prior life and are dealing with it now. But Dean, I'd like to hear your perspective.
The industry has an education issue here. That there's no question about it, in the sense that consumers really don't understand technologically or in cost terms what they're really being asked to pay for in a long-term energy transition here. And I think the thing that is a ray of hope and has, as Lorraine was saying, some real teeth to it, where costs can come down, and in some cases things can be more economic or more affordable. In many cases, the things today are not necessarily economic without subsidies in place to make them happen. Now, that's not the question between, if you're comparing electricity from fuel oil compared with wind or solar, which is just as competitive as natural gas, if not lower in some places. But when we're looking at longer term issues, just to put it in perspective, when API goes and does a focus group or a study on, well, how do people feel about the energy transition? There's almost universal support for this kind of progress. Everybody wants to lower emissions. The next question is, what are you really willing to pay for it? And there are different levels for this, but if you ask people, almost nobody says they'll pay more than about $10 a month, $120 a year. The most common response is about $1 a month. And we're talking many, many orders of magnitude larger than this. And when we look at the costs, former CBO economist Douglas Holtz-Eakin had done a quantification of just the move toward electrification nationwide, interconnecting grids, taking even the low-cost measures, but then trying to move to 100% renewables with storage mechanisms across the country. That part of the Green New Deal by itself was $3 to $4 trillion. Talking $39,000 for every single household in the United States. So the idea that you're going to mesh these orders of magnitude in terms of nationwide costs of reaching these goals, we have to aspire and we have to make technological and real economic progress in this direction. But meshing that with the consumer reality of what these things could actually cost is a potential disconnect, and both a disconnect in the policy understanding of it as well as the household understanding of what they're being asked to pay for.
So Lorraine, I want you to respond. Before I do, I'm going to offer the audience a program note. If you have any questions for us, please go ahead and send them to APAICS. I understand they have an open email where people can ask questions, and then they will forward them to us, and we would then. Please go to the Facebook page, I'm told, of APAICS and offer your questions. Post your questions on Facebook, and they'll forward them to us, and we'll be happy to read them aloud. We do want to build in some time on the back end for questions from our viewing audience. So Lorraine, over back to you. The floor is yours to respond to my question.
I think
and to respond to Dean.
Yeah, I think, Dean has hit on some, real issues for utilities. I think it's really more, some of that education work has to be within the utility. I mean, the utility culture has to change and be receptive to innovation, and also be receptive to, a new paradigm of using customer resources behind the meter. And you see some there's kind of a ranking, what was recently done about, I think SEPA did it, of smart energy type of utilities that are trying to do that transformation. And you've got it runs the gamut from some cooperatives like SMUD, Green Mountain Power, to big players like PG&E and Southern California Edison that are seeing that it's important to involve the customer. Before it was just a kind of a one-way cord. We just sell you the widgets of kilowatt hours, and it's a very traditional centralized distribution system. We generate, and there's a large scale plant, and we send, the widget of power out to you. That paradigm has changed because of a lot of innovation in terms of non-wires alternatives, grid technology, distributed energy resources. And I think something that we haven't talked about, as we get to more high amounts of renewable energy, really is the usage of energy efficiency and demand side management, because we can't build enough plants, whether they're traditional fossil plants or renewable energy plants. Part of that is managing the load. managing the demand. And those are just as important tools in the toolkit. And that's why in Hawaii, back in 2014, the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, when I was there, issued the white paper, which we talked about inclinations, and we gave a strategic roadmap on the pathway for how Hawaii's utilities of the future could take action to get there, in terms of being high performing utilities that are cost effective, productive, energy prices affordable, still integrating renewable energy. So it is really involving, and we hear about it, the prosumer. I think we can't categorize the customer as being, just one type of customer, and there are many generations of customers now. Millennials are very savvy, and you don't have to be a millennial or Gen Z. Customers, when given the choice, can I save money? If I participate in this energy efficiency program or this demand side management program, saves me money. And now with all these smart devices, our phones, our thermostats, everything can be controlled, based on what I would like. So as people get more savvy and able to use those tools, customers become enabled, empowered, and much more the prosumer. And the savvy utilities realize that. That's the way to keep customer not only satisfaction for their rankings in terms of, performance, but also to keep customers loyal when you're in a jurisdiction where you might have retail choice. I mean, I come from a jurisdiction where it's fully vertically integrated, investor-owned utility on most of the islands, monopoly. Even the rural cooperative has a total monopoly on the island, but that's not always true. So how in a free retail market, how do you keep customers? Well, by being, the best at providing energy that's cost effective and giving them the tools that they can be proactive and feel like they are in control. And with distributed energy resources and the smart home and the smart grid technology, that's much more doable. But we do have to address the digital divide. And that's why there is that issue of underserved communities that don't have that access. I mean, if we don't make those types of same resources available to communities, that's when we have conflicts and issues of it is incumbent on us to harness that consumer power, harness that knowledge, because people given a choice, they know how to manage their budget. If you tell people you can use your washer dryer, and you can.
I believe we've lost Lorraine. Or at
Yeah,
least,
and I was going to ask her a follow-up question. Unfortunately,
well, I'd love to weigh in on what she's said already.
Yeah. Go ahead and respond. We'll give her a summary when she's back online. But go ahead, Dean.
No, I mean, she's made some excellent points, and she's offered some very good local examples. The question is whether those examples can generalize.
She's back.
Am I still
I believe Lorraine's back. Okay.
Okay.
But go.
Did I get
I'll tell you what.
Too? I don't know, Bob. It's like it's going from one person to another. Did I get disconnected? Well,
you fell out. But let's do this. Dean was about to respond to you while you were gone, so
we lost you. Sorry.
Well, let's let Dean go ahead, and then this is a conversation anyway. So Dean, you go ahead and then tell us your thoughts about what Lorraine just said, and Lorraine, feel free to respond to Dean. So go ahead.
No, I was saying, Lorraine, that you've offered some really strong and good local examples, and the question is how general are those lessons? It certainly is applicable to the future of the electricity industry, smart grids, change in technology, interconnection, and you're highlighting exactly the most cost-effective ways to go about trying to achieve low-cost solutions while supplying the electricity that people will need as well. The 85% renewable penetration, and I know you know this, but the costs for going from like 20 to 50% renewables, that's one cost level. 50 to 70, it's a higher cost level. But by the time you get to 80 or the goal of 100% renewables, those costs go up exponentially for the storage solutions. And there are not cost-effective solutions on a utility scale to go for days or to last through the kinds of crises that we've seen through hurricanes. The Texas storms were a great example earlier this year. And in fact, the Texas storms, APAICS here in Washington, D.C. had an excellent graph of showing how natural gas had picked up for the intermittency of wind with record deliverability of natural gas through those winter storms. And it really raises the question of, now that we're getting to the summer, we're talking about brownouts in Texas, in California, in New York. In some of these areas like New York and New England and California, for the peak periods, we can't get enough natural gas into the market to supply the peak electricity demand today. So forget the transition and the stress that puts on grid reliability and resilience going forward. We have real issues in terms of infrastructure. And by the way, the same infrastructure resistance of building new pipelines or expanding existing pipelines that exist for natural gas or for oil across the country, if you want the vision for electrification moving that direction, you also need to put new transmission, new generation. A lot of these same rights of way and other infrastructure issues very much come into play. So there are affordability challenges, and I don't want to put a damper on this in the sense that I think you've got exactly the right vision for cost-effective solutions, change in technology, and the progress that must be made. And we need a market-based way of getting those into play and having those come to fruition, while also enabling infrastructure so that all these sources can compete and get the most cost-effective ways of producing the energy that we as households and we as an economy in the United States really need.
Yeah, and I really don't think that the end all be all is total electrification. I think there is a role for other areas. I mean, decarbonization doesn't necessarily mean just electrification. So
Agreed.
you can decarbonize
Completely agree.
other sectors like natural gas. I mean, we're looking at new developments now in terms of transitioning some old coal plants. LADWP is working with Intermountain Power. Perfect example, retrofitting an old coal plant to be initially a natural gas plant, but then to be transitioning to a renewable hydrogen plant. With excess renewables that are being curtailed, like solar and wind, you can use that instead to create renewable hydrogen. And there's a massive, now effort, not only in the EU, of course, it's still expensive with the electrolyzer technology, but solar batteries, before the whole gigawatt requirement of putting storage in. So, a lot of times the market drives the production of new technologies, or just better ways of getting the same technology out to market. And the demand and the volume can make the prices go down. So if we do see a robust development of another aspect in the toolkit of decarbonization, which could be renewable hydrogen, renewable natural gas, you're harvesting methane instead of flaring that off of landfills or wastewater treatment plants. They're doing that also in Hawaii, with our gas utility, Hawaii Gas, and the City County of Honolulu have an agreement to harvest the methane from the sewage, treatment plants, to harvest potentially the methane from closed cells in the landfill instead of flaring that. And, methane is even more, of an impact in terms of emissions than even CO2. So that's a very dangerous component that's going out into the atmosphere. So it's a multifaceted approach. And so there's not one tool in the toolkit. It has to be coordinated, and all these tools must be used together in a productive fashion. And I think that's really the key is the leadership it takes to do that strategically. Utilities working with energy commissions and energy departments in their respective states, with the regulators as well, facilitating that with the regulatory framework that allows the flexibility of utilities to innovate. And that's really, the regulatory process itself is not, as former regulators, we need to take some of the responsibility too. The regulatory process definitely needs to be improved. And that's why the performance-based regulation work that's being done in Hawaii is very important, that it frees up utilities from being on that, the only people that make money in terms of a rate case are really the lawyers and the experts. It's a time consumption for the utility.
Hey, wait a minute. You're threatening my livelihood, but go ahead.
And for the regulatory staff and, for commission staff, it takes a year out of your life when you have to get ready for a rate case. So don't we have more productive usage of that time and allowing more flexibility for in between rate cases to deploy capital to where it's needed and to save money and to cost save, and also to share in those cost savings. I think that's what, that's a new business model, a new way of operating in the energy sector. But it's all aspects of the energy sector. It's not just the electric sector, although the electric sector is very important because of the integrated energy network. So we're all interrelated. It is the ecosystem that we're talking about here.
I was told that as moderator, I can also weigh into a discussion. I'm going to take this opportunity to ask each of you a very specific question that is that's reflecting a viewpoint with a question mark added to the back end. So I'm going to go with Dean first, and then I'll ask Lorraine. And I'll ask both questions at once, so you know that I'm not trying to single anybody out and put you on the spot. But it's based upon some statements both of you made that I'm going to ask it. It's not intended to be confrontational, but it's intended to challenge you. The first one, Dean, deals with what happened in Texas. I've actually been spending a great deal of time examining what happened there. And I do understand your statement about the role of natural gas and the fact that it did play in part some beneficial role in helping to shore up some energy assuredness that the renewables could not play during that winter peak. On the other hand, half of the volume of production in Texas was not available, the gas production. The problem was not lack of gas infrastructure. The problem was lack of weatherization of the existing infrastructure and the failure to coordinate the gas being produced in the fields and being sold to the power generators that had a disconnect between, which is largely not just engineering, but contractual, to solidify commitments so that during times of peak demand, those power generators would continue to have power to provide electricity for the grid in critical parts of the infrastructure. That's my statement, and I want you to respond to it. But let me turn to Lorraine and offer her my observation. And I'm going to give each of you as much time to respond to both those observations. Lorraine, I get your point that the solution to energy affordability in a transformed grid is to enable the customer, is to enhance customer engagement and customer involvement, to give them control over how their energy is consumed, during which times of the day, and for what uses. I get that. I'm 100% sold on that. But you yourself have pointed out the problem is the equivalent of this digital divide that we saw in the telecom transformation. You still have large income disparities between the haves and have-nots. The upper income people will have access to those whiz-bang technologies sooner than would people living in multifamily dwellings and in low-income areas. So I would like to hear more from you about what we can do to address that issue. But let me turn back to Dean. Dean, if you can respond to my thoughts, and then Lorraine, at you afterwards.
No, thanks, Bob. It's an excellent question. I don't want to get lost in the details of exactly what happened in mid to late February in Texas and Oklahoma. There were winterization issues, and having lived and worked 4 years in Canada, I can tell you that these are completely things that can be overcome, but they come with a higher cost level when you're going to build that extent of weatherization into the network. Also, keep in mind that to lower emissions, that some of the standards that were put in place by many producers were to have the compression on gas pipelines be based on electricity, not in burning natural gas. And then when electricity went down, hence you didn't get natural gas to market. If we look at the U.S. Energy Information Administration's deliverability of natural gas during that critical week when things were really going offline, 123 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas was delivered out of storage, if not directly from the field in terms of field production, but never higher. We've never seen more natural gas go to market. So the market found a way. It was going, and the prices that were traded at wholesale prices at different trading hubs for natural gas in Texas and Oklahoma and across the broader region reflected where there were shortages. And again, efficient price signals sent the gas where economically it was most meant to go. But I think there were a lot of lessons learned, both from a natural gas standpoint, the performance and reliability and resiliency of renewables, the grid, its interconnection. There were a lot of lessons learned that weren't specific to natural gas. And I think natural gas did step up with the most deliverability we've ever seen in the United States. So it is hard to fault it completely, though there are some completely addressable concerns in there. I want to weigh in a little bit on Lorraine's question about the affordability when we talk about who's paying for whom in an energy transition, and this goes into our infrastructure as well. When we talk about electric vehicles in particular, a lot of the incentive mechanisms that are being asked to be paid for out of a tax base or by everybody, primarily today benefit households with 6-digit incomes. So there are issues that I think go back to, yes, these are new technologies, they are the vanguard, but asking lower income households to contribute to funding that also is somewhat regressive.
Lorraine, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I agree. We have unequal burdens. I mean, and that's what I said in the very beginning when I started my remarks, was we have to address and decrease the energy burden on those communities that are under-resourced. I mean, we can get a debate, look at the tax. President Biden just, issued some policy about reforming our tax system so that the top 5% of our country is very wealthy, pay their fair share. So we have this divide, whether it's in taxation or whether it's in, access to technology as a customer for communities. And I think that the policy and programs that have come to the forefront here are community-based renewable energy programs, because it's true. And this has nothing to do with being, low, moderate income. Many places, are urban development areas where people live in multifamily dwellings. I think Bob highlighted that in the question to me. So we don't have access to individual rooftop solar or PV. So how do you allow and afford people the opportunity? We have community solar, community renewables, that could be community wind. States like Minnesota have let us out, but there are other states now that have robust community renewable programs, Hawaii included, to allow people to subscribe into renewable energy programs that afford energy at a lower level, allow people to reduce their bill costs because they're getting energy from that source as opposed to the traditional fossil sources, which are soon to be actually deactivated and retired in our jurisdiction. But that these are different programs, and working with community-based organizations that help you plan these types of programs, so you're addressing the needs of the members in those communities, is key. I mean, integrated grid planning is not just the engineers and the industry, big commercial customers having input, but it's everybody. So it really is involving community-based organizations in your integrated resource planning. And that's a big paradigm shift for many utilities. The other thing is really doing, turning the electricity model on its head. And for many years, microgrids were kind of the no word for utilities because they thought it was going to be defection and erode customer base. But microgrids now are a solution, as we address impacts of climate change. And also, it just makes more sense to put the generation closer to the load. To if people, if we have larger commercial customers that can host, renewables, whether it's renewable wind or wind resources or solar resources, and in a microgrid that can serve the other customers in their affected area, can be a resilient area. It can island off if need be. If the rest of the grid goes down, it can remain powered. Campuses, hospitals, critical infrastructure. This is all important because when you look at the social costs, the economic costs that come from the impacts of climate change. We see that in Puerto Rico. People died because they couldn't have access to medical care, refrigeration for their medicines, hospitals. It wasn't from the hurricane itself. So it's these other effects that come. And so jurisdictions like Hawaii, in fact, our own city and county of Honolulu has a robust resilience strategy action plan that's been recognized nationwide as we're planning for these things. And energy is a key part of that. Energy resilience hubs, and the microgrids are part of that. I think PG&E and some of the utilities in California, SDGE, they're talking about that with the wildfires that are happening. That especially now with high temperatures, wildfires, drought, having microgrids to be able to island off and avoid some of the causes of the catastrophic fires that are there, because you're not transmitting over big transmission lines. You're cutting things off and energizing in smaller pockets closer to where the people live, and especially in rural underserved communities. So there's many, again, different tools in the toolkit. Hawaii, has, and Puerto Rico have let out microgrid services tariff. Again, that's where the regulation comes in. You need to have the regulatory framework to incentivize and enable the utility to, to develop and allow customers to develop microgrids and implement that, whether that's the interconnection and the tariffs themselves, when the microgrids stay connected, when they disconnect for emergency or backup purposes, that all that has to be addressed. And so they're doing that right now. There's a microgrid service tariff that I just got adopted in Hawaii. They're continuing the next phase of that. A non-emergency, when we're just as a regular, can we do B2B, commercial wheeling? It's a whole different way of doing business for the utility.
Let me ask Lorraine, and this gets into, again, the public response. And this is, I don't know the answer to this question, so this is an innocent fact-finding question. Have you discovered, or has there been any instance of public resistance to microgrids in the same sense that they would resist the building of a transmission or distribution line? I don't know the answer to that, and I would welcome anything that you know in that regard, whether the public is viewing this type of infrastructure differently than they would a transmission or distribution line.
I'll take a crack at that. I think the public views it differently. The microgrid is something that they can use. It's either, if they're part of that microgrid, it is important because they can have power, especially when you don't have that, propane generator or, diesel backup generator, the little Honda or, generator you can power up when your power goes out and you need to, barbecue all the food in your refrigerator before it rots, right? So, I mean, it's like, I think people get it in terms of resilience, especially if they've experienced power outages, which a lot of folks have now as we go across the US and we're seeing the impacts of climate change. Extreme weather is the new normal in many areas, and it's unfortunate. We have to plan for it. As you pointed out, Bob, the weatherization issues, it's no longer the 1 in 100 year event. It is happening with more frequency, and that is exactly what regulators are requiring utilities to do. And so the public gets it because they're the ones who bear the brunt of the effects of the adverse outcome. So I do not see, have not observed that people are pushing back on microgrids. They're pushing back instead on, I don't want that big transmission substation upgrade right in my backyard, right next to the playground where my kids play, and I'm worried that they might get cancer or, some other adverse health effect.
So what I'm hearing, what I'm hearing is that the opportunities for microgrids are different than there would have been that had been the case for transmission or distribution lines, because the public sees a real and tangible benefit, namely increased resiliency and energy reliability from a microgrid sited near their home or business, and therefore are willing to accept the additional siting responsibility for that microgrid. Is that a fair expression of what you just said, or if I
think that example, Bob, of the Marcus Garvey Village microgrid project? I mean, I always use that example because Con Ed was ahead of its, ahead of many of the utilities and did that. They housed that microgrid at the Marcus Garvey Village.
We've got a little connectivity problem.
Oh, can you hear me?
Dean, let me let me turn back to you in the interim. Lorraine, are you back?
I'm back.
You were talking about the Marcus Garvey project, and then you got cut off all your.
You hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay. The Marcus Garvey Village project is a prime example of exactly what you said. The Con Ed was ahead of its time in terms of, the utilities were not, implementing microgrids, but they did because it provided resilience. It was in a constrained area, constrained distribution transmission area. And it also provided a community resilience center because it was on the Marcus Garvey Community Center. But it saved other customers of Con Ed money because instead of having to do a substation upgrade, a transmission upgrade that was super costly, by putting a microgrid there to address the congestion in the circuit around that area benefited all customers, not just Marcus Garvey Village. But what the residents of Marcus Garvey got was they got a community resilience center, which after the experience of Superstorm Sandy was very evident we need to have resilience centers should the power go down in our community.
Great example. Dean, let me turn to you. Similar siting question, this time gas infrastructure. What are you doing to address that? You've got a huge issue. People just don't want new pipelines built anywhere near, anywhere close, anywhere. As they say, it's either banana or NIMTU, the acronym. Build absolutely nothing anywhere, anytime. NIMTU, not in my term of office. So what do you do?
I mean, this is an ongoing issue, and it's not unique to natural gas. It applies to product pipelines, to crude oil pipelines, to natural gas liquid pipelines, and frankly, the entire transformation that U.S. natural gas and oil have seen in terms of the productivity and the production, and shifting from having been a big net importer in the previous decade to, by 2020, being a net exporter of petroleum for the first time since 1958. These are remarkable accomplishments that don't happen without the infrastructure, especially for natural gas, especially in the Appalachian region. So this is Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, which have become the largest producing region for pure natural gas in the United States. The ability to grow that after another year or two needs more pipeline. And with the cancellation of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, with the Biden administration's first action being the cancellation on the oil side of the Keystone XL pipeline, of either the administration or the courts potentially invalidating the Dakota Access Pipeline's environmental impact assessment, which could take that pipeline out of service. And we watch this week to week right now to see if that's going to happen. That's a critical conduit for egress of oil coming from North Dakota. So the entire state's production, if it doesn't have that, it adds substantial cost to shift and find an alternate means of transport. So whether we're talking about liquids or natural gas, infrastructure is an ongoing issue. And we try as API to educate. We try to engage at both state and local levels to make people aware of the trade-offs and to highlight the benefits that even when a pipeline's going through, the value of having this infrastructure has been really to decouple the kind of price pressures that we saw really between 2000 and 2010 leading up to the great financial crisis. Energy has become abundant and increasingly affordable as a result of having this domestic production. It's shifted us from a trade balance perspective to having increasing exports and the kinds of large multi-billion-dollar capital projects that a generation ago just didn't exist in the United States. So in addition to getting at our current project backlog, by the way, if we look at just pipelines, processing, export facilities for both liquids and natural gas, refinery and petrochemical expansions, this last quarter, $177 billion worth of export projects. This is phenomenal. And compared to a generation ago when we had few, if any, of these projects, that's a tremendous gain. So there are a lot of economic benefits, household benefits that are nationwide that go with this. And it is an education challenge, and that infrastructure resistance definitely exists. So I think that's part of why API exists and trying to educate and engage on these issues because they are critically important.
Let me do this. I'm getting the high side. We need to close out, but let me give each of you 1 minute before we finally adjourn to basically share with us any parting thoughts about what you see in terms of the challenges of addressing energy affordability. Lorraine, why don't you go first? Just take about another minute.
I think I just give here are the 5 things I think in order to accomplish what we want to accomplish, we need to decrease the energy burden. We need to drive equitable economic growth. We need to, enable infrastructure transition, revitalize our energy communities, and really prioritize the assets that do the most harm. So, the things that are really impacting our communities from a health and environmental, perspective, we need to prioritize those, addressing those things. And if we can, accomplish that, those are the main areas in terms of looking at it as a policymaker and a regulator.
Dean, go ahead.
I like the way Lorraine just phrased those. I think the cost effectiveness and the idea that you can greatly incentivize a transition in energy or a very different set of consumer behavior without a price on carbon emissions is very challenging from an economic perspective. And this is part of why, through API's recent formation of a climate action framework, is actively proposing and advancing that there be a price on carbon emissions. This is sort of the political third rail, though, right? Because it makes transparent those costs. They ultimately will affect consumer behavior. But if you're trying to, in your phrase earlier, Bob, of not in my term, it's hard to get reelected if you're raising taxes, right?
Yes.
And these are things that are real issues that you really can't hide this if you want a fundamental transition in the behavior. Technology is the sink in the system, and we've talked about, and Lorraine has highlighted some excellent examples where we can make progress in those that are cost effective. But we need a lot more. And if we're going to look at it both as a state, a local, a national, or a global perspective, the more we can get scale on this and have global cooperation on these things, the more likely we are to achieve the outcomes.
Excellent. I want to thank both of these excellent speakers for taking the time to be with us today to share us their best thoughts. As the audience can tell, our country has some challenges ahead. Not everybody agrees. We all know, however, that one of our goals is to make energy accessible and affordable to all incomes, all classes, all communities. Thank you so much, Dean. Thank you so much, Lorraine. And on behalf of APAICS, I want to thank our audience for being with us today. We will close out this panel now. I encourage our audience to stay tuned for the second panel of our summit today. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you both.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.